Welcome to the Doctrine Deep Dive. We are going straight into the deep end today, really getting into a master's level exploration of political participation.
Yeah, it's a topic that seems simple on the surface, right? Voting.
Exactly. We often have this maybe romantic idea of voting as just this pure individual expression of civic will. But, the sources we're digging into today, they paint a much more complicated picture.
Definitely more complex.
Yeah.
And maybe a bit unsettling, too. It suggests participation isn't just about personal motivation. It's heavily engineered.
Engineered, yeah. Shaped fundamentally by these institutional rules and, wow, intensely strategic campaigns.
And that tension, Kelly, that's really the core of what we're diving into. We're looking at this gap between let's call them the micro-level drivers of participation.
Like, why does one person decide to show up? The cost versus benefit calculation.
Precisely that, and then contrasting it with the macro-level structures, the big rules that dictate which of those votes actually count, and crucially, how much weight they carry in the end.
So our mission today is to really tackle what you'd find as foundational reading in an advanced political behavior course. We're zeroing in on mobilization, voter turnout, and those big institutional structures influencing participation.
And we are definitely standing on the shoulders of giants for this one. For participation and mobilization, we're leaning heavily on that retrospective analysis by Donald P. Green and Michael Schwambaird.
Right, the one reviewing Stephen J. Rosenstone and John Mark Hansen's landmark 1993 book, Mobilization, Participation, and Democracy in America.
That's the one, a book that really shifted the whole field of study.
It really did. It kind of forced political scientists to stop only looking at who people are, their demographics, and start looking hard at what campaigns actually do.
Exactly. Then, for the institutional piece, we dive right into that, let's say, thorny debate around the Electoral College.
Oh, yeah, definitely thorny.
We're drawing on some key articles there. Edward B. Foley, Richard A. Posner, and Robert Speel. They offer really distinct, sometimes clashing takes, whether this whole constitutional mechanism still, makes sense today.
Okay, so a lot to unpack there. Let's start with those micro-foundations. Mobilization, turnout. The Rosenstone and Hansen effect. Okay, so Rosenstone and Hansen, you said they initiated a seismic shift. Before them, research like Wolfinger and Rosenstone's earlier Who Votes, it was mostly about those static background things, right?
That's absolutely right. The classic model was almost purely socioeconomic. You wanted to predict voting. You looked at education, income, maybe wealth.
Things that are pretty fixed, at least in the short term.
Exactly. And they correlate strongly with participation, no doubt. The thinking was sort of higher socioeconomic status makes it easier to get information, understand the issues, reduces the cost of voting. And these models were actually pretty good at predicting who votes.
There's always a but.
Right. But they were pretty terrible at explaining why turnout goes up and down over time, or why it's different in one election versus another.
Yeah, like if education levels kept rising, why did turnout generally fall after the 1960s for a while? The static model just couldn't answer that dynamic question.
Precisely. And that's where Rosenstone and Hansen came in. They brought in the dynamic element. They argued, look, if you want to explain changes in turnout, the surges, the dips, why turnout in Ohio is different from California, you have to look at the factors that push people, that induce them to act.
The political environment itself.
The environment, driven largely by mobilization. That's the engine, they argued.
And they defined mobilization quite broadly, didn't they? It wasn't just the official campaign stuff.
No, and that was critical. It was really everything that prompted action. So yes, the formal campaign, appeals phone banks, canvassers knocking on your door, the mailers, all that.
The stuff we all get.
Right. But also, crucially, the informal social interactions. Just chatting with friends, family, coworkers about politics. Stuff that might just pique someone's interest enough to get them to register or maybe look up a candidate online.
That's a really important shift. It moves the focus from just the voters' internal psychology to what political elites and organizations are actively doing.
Exactly. It puts agency back onto the campaigns and the political environment.
Now, their first big claim was pretty bold, right? They linked that post-1960s decline in turnout directly to a drop in these mobilization efforts.
Very ambitious. They suggested campaigns had perhaps become less reliant on grassroots, person-to-person contact, maybe more focused on media.
And how did that specific claim hold up?
Well, that statistical correlation, it drew criticism almost immediately. And, for a foundational text, it's important to understand these critiques. Abramson, Aldrich, and Rode, for example, they looked at the American National Election Studies survey data and questioned whether campaign activity levels had really declined that much in presidential years. They argued the reported contact wasn't changing enough to explain such a big turnout drop,
So the data maybe didn't fully support the idea of less contact.
at least not enough to explain the whole trend, they argued. And then another really fundamental critique came from Michael McDonald and Samuel Popkin. They went after the turnout rate calculation itself.
How so?
They argued that the way we were measuring turnout decline was flawed. Researchers were using the voting age population, everyone over 18, as the denominator.
Okay.
But McDonald and Popkin pointed out that a growing share of adults were actually ineligible to vote. Think about increased numbers of non-United States citizens or stricter felony disenfranchisement laws in some states.
Ah, so the pool of potential voters was shrinking relative to the total adult population.
Exactly. When they adjusted the denominator to only include the voting eligible population, that long-term decline looked, well, much less dramatic. Some argued it almost disappeared for a while.
Okay, so the original claim linking the scale of the decline directly to less mobilization was, let's say, statistically complicated. Why is the Rosenstone and Hansen thesis still so central then?
Because the core theoretical insight proved incredibly powerful and, frankly, predictive, especially when you look at what happened after 1993.
Right.
Green and Schwambaird, in their retrospective, really highlight this. The massive rebound in turnout we saw after 2004, 2008, 2012, even 2020, that fits the Rosenstone and Hansen model beautifully.
How so?
Because campaigns in those years became incredibly sophisticated, highly energized, data-driven, and they poured unprecedented resources into mobilization. Get out the vote efforts exploded, and turnout rose right alongside it.
So even if the explanation for the 70s and 80s dip was messy, the principle holds: when campaigns mobilize hard, more people vote. The volume of activity matters?
Exactly. The core idea that mobilization is a key dynamic driver of turnout was validated by later events. It became the cornerstone for understanding turnout fluctuations. #TB. The strategic calculus of campaign mobilization.
Okay, this leads perfectly into the whole strategic calculus idea, which, sounds a bit cynical, but feels very real. Campaigns aren't mobilizing everyone out of some pure commitment to democracy.
Oh, absolutely not. They mobilize to maximize electoral returns, full stop. They act like intensely rational actors with scarce resources.
And that rationality leads them to target very specific people and places.
Precisely. It boils down to two main things: targeting geography and targeting groups.
Let's start with geography. The Electoral College pretty much dictates this, right? Campaigns have to saturate the close battleground states.
Completely. If you live in a state where the outcome is basically known beforehand, California for Democrats, Wyoming for Republicans, say you are, from a strategic standpoint, almost irrelevant to the presidential campaign.
Even if you're a really committed voter in that state.
Doesn't matter to the national campaign's resource allocation. Their money and time are finite. They have to pour it into Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Arizona, maybe Georgia, Nevada, wherever those electoral votes are truly up for grabs. Campaign efficiency basically demands ignoring, 80% of the electorate?
Wow. And that strategic exclusion, it happens at the group level, too. The sources talk about targeting groups with lopsided partisan proclivities, basically bankable votes.
Think about it like a campaign manager. You've got limited resources for outreach. Are you going to spend it on someone who might vote for you or someone who almost certainly will if you just nudge them?
You go for the sure thing.
Right. So if you're the Republican campaign, targeting, say, high-propensity conservative Christian voters gives you a reliable, bankable vote. You know their leanings. The conversion rate from contact to vote will likely be high. Same logic for Democrats targeting African Americans. These groups get mobilized heavily. Reliable return on investment.
And the flip side is, groups whose preferences aren't so clear-cut, they often get left out, even if they're large groups.
The classic example often cited is Asian Americans. As a group, their partisan preferences are more diverse, less predictably aligned with one party. So mobilization efforts towards them are often less intense. It's expensive work, mobilization. Campaigns are reluctant to spend that money if it doesn't reliably produce a vote for them.
It's all about strategic efficiency, not broad inclusion.
It is. And this whole strategic logic targeting specific places and specific groups, which Rosenstone and Hansen described based on 1993 realities, it was an incredibly clear precursor to what we now call micro-targeting.
Ah, right. Using big data to get even more specific.
Exactly. Rosenstone and Hansen's theory basically laid the intellectual groundwork. Micro-targeting is just the technological refinement of that same strategic calculus.
Yeah.
Now, with vast commercial data sets and predictive algorithms, campaigns can forecast likely supporters with stunning precision,
Down to the individual voter, not just the group or the neighborhood.
down to the specific house address. So instead of a campaign maybe writing off an entire precinct because it leans heavily Democrat,
They can now use micro-targeting to find and talk to just the, say, 3 registered Republicans living on that one block.
that's the dream for them. That's the efficiency gain.
Yeah.
You bypass the waste. You're not targeting groups anymore, really. You're targeting individuals predicted to support you, even if they live in unfriendly territory.
Which makes the campaigns even more efficient at mobilizing their voters.
Hyper-efficient, as Green and Schwambaird confirm, but also potentially even more selective in who gets contacted and encouraged.
Okay, but here's where the science part gets really rigorous. The early mobilization research, like you said, used surveys, the American National Election Studies, for example. They found this strong correlation. People who said they were contacted by a campaign were also more likely to say they voted.
Right, and the natural conclusion, the interpretation, was causation. Contact causes turnout. Mobilization works by lowering information costs or creating social incentives, they thought.
But correlation isn't causation, as they say.
As they constantly say in methods classes, yes. And this reliance on observational data, it sparked what political scientists call the credibility revolution, a demand for a much higher standard of proof for causal claims.
Primarily using randomized field experiments.
Exactly. The critics really honed in on 3 major skeptical concerns about those early observational studies. These really undermine the simple causal story. Let's start with the big one, spurious correlation, also known as the targeting critique.
Okay.
This goes right back to the strategic calculus we just discussed. If campaigns are smart, and we assume they aren't contacting people randomly. They are targeting people who are already likely voters.
So the contact and the voting are both caused by some third factor, the person's underlying propensity to vote.
Precisely. The correlation is spurious. The campaign contact didn't cause the vote. It was just directed at someone who was probably going to vote anyway. The contact is just a marker for selection bias.
Like, if I only send flyers to people with a history of voting in primaries and they vote again, my flyer didn't necessarily make them vote.
Exactly. So to figure out the true effect of contact, researchers needed what's called exogenous variation. The contact needed to be random, assigned externally, not based on the voter's own characteristics.
Which is what randomized controlled trials or field experiments do. Randomly assign who gets the flyer or the phone call.
Correct. You create statistically identical treatment and control groups. Any difference in turnout between them must be due to the treatment, the mobilization effort. That was the methodological leap needed.
Okay, what was the second big critique? Accessibility bias.
Right. This one says, even if a campaign tries to contact randomly, the kind of people they successfully reach might be different in ways that matter for voting.
How so?
Think about who answers phone calls from unknown numbers, or who's home during the day when canvassers knock. These people might just be more accessible, maybe have certain kinds of jobs or lifestyles.
And those same traits might also make them more likely to be civically engaged or likely to vote anyway.
Exactly. Contactability itself could just be a marker for some unmeasured personal trait. Maybe conscientiousness, maybe social trust that's also correlated with voting.
And there's experimental evidence for this, isn't there? The studies calling about non-political things.
Yes, fascinating studies. Researchers randomly assign people to get calls about, say, wearing seatbelts or donating blood, completely unrelated to politics. And they found that the people who simply answered the phone for these non-political calls were already significantly more likely to be found in the voting records later on.
Wow. So just being reachable correlates with voting.
It seems so. Which means the contact variable in those old surveys was likely contaminated by this accessibility bias. The campaign wasn't necessarily causing the turnout. It was just better at finding people who were already inclined to participate and easier to reach.
Okay, and the third concern, measurement error. This is about the data itself.
Yeah, this is fundamental. Observational studies relied on people telling surveyors whether they voted and whether they remembered being contacted. Both are prone to error.
People might say they voted even if they didn't.
Oh, absolutely. It's called social desirability bias. Voting is seen as a good civic duty, so people tend to over-report their turnout compared to actual validated vote records.
And they might also misreport being contacted. Maybe they think they should have been, or they confuse general election noise with specific contact.
Right. Or they just misremember vague questions like, did anyone from a party contact you? All this noise, this misreporting, tends to inflate the apparent relationship between contact and voting in surveys. It makes the effect look bigger than it really is.
So the credibility revolution basically said, look, these survey correlations are interesting, but they're likely inflated and possibly spurious. We need experiments to know what really works.
Exactly. It forced a huge shift in the methodology and fundamentally changed our understanding of mobilization's effects.
All right, so after political science ran, hundreds, maybe thousands of these field experiments testing every mobilization tactic under the sun, what did we actually learn? What are the stubborn facts from the experimental literature?
Well, the first big takeaway is a general validation of Rosenstone and Hansen's core idea. Mobilization does work. Encouraging people to vote does causally increase turnout rates.
So the basic theory is right, just maybe the estimated size of the effect in the old studies was off.
Exactly. The theory held, but the experiments provided crucial nuance about how it works, what works, and the scale of the effects.
And the precision of experiments was pretty brutal on some commonly used tactics, right? Things campaigns spend money on that just don't do much.
Oh, absolutely. The experimental evidence is quite definitive on some things. For example, those pre-recorded phone calls, robocalls. Repeated experiments show they have negligible effects, close to zero impact on turnout.
So all those annoying calls are likely pointless.
From a turnout perspective, the evidence suggests yes. Similarly, things like generic emails or standard direct mail pieces that just remind people of the election date or provide purely informational content, like a sample ballot. They also tend to show very weak or negligible effects.
Just giving information isn't enough to overcome inertia for most people.
Often, no. Simply lowering the information cost doesn't seem to be the main barrier for many non-voters.
Okay, so if the cheap mass communication tools are mostly ineffective, what does work according to the experiments?
It really seems to boil down to two key things, and they both point towards the social nature of voting. First, quality interaction.
Meaning?
Authentic, personal, ideally non-routinized interaction. Think door-to-door canvassing where there's a real conversation, or phone banks using trained callers who don't just read a rigid script. These are more expensive, obviously.
But they work better.
They seem to. That genuine human interaction appears to create a stronger sense of connection, or maybe social obligation, that a postcard just can't replicate.
Okay, quality interaction. What's the second lever?
Leveraging social norms. This is probably one of the most striking, maybe even slightly uncomfortable findings from the experimental literature.
How so?
Messages that forcefully emphasize civic duty can work. But what works even better are messages that remind voters, sometimes quite bluntly, that who votes is a matter of public record.
Ah, the social pressure angle. Knowing your neighbors might know if you voted or not.
Exactly. Tapping into that prescriptive social norm. The idea that good citizens vote and that participation, or non-participation, is observable. It's a very powerful motivator. It's less about appealing to patriotism and more about, frankly, appealing to a desire to avoid social disapproval. Some might even call it leveraging shame.
Wow. So it's less about inspiration, more about social accountability.
The strongest experimental effects often come from these social pressure messages. It highlights that voting isn't just a private calculation. It's deeply embedded in social context.
This also brings us back to the scale of the effects. Those old observational studies sometimes claimed huge effects, like 7 or 10 percentage point increases in turnout from mobilization. Experiments showed much smaller effects.
Much smaller and much more realistic. The experiment showed those earlier estimates were likely wildly inflated by the biases we discussed, targeting and measurement error.
So what's considered a successful effect size now?
In the experimental literature, achieving even a 5 percentage point increase in turnout from a specific mobilization program is considered a very strong, very successful result. Usually effects are smaller, maybe 1 or 2 points for many interventions.
That really puts things in perspective. It takes a lot of effort to move the needle even slightly.
It does. It provides a necessary sense of proportion for campaigns and analysts.
But this leads to a kind of normative puzzle or irony, doesn't it? If mobilization works, but campaigns are strategic and target likely voters, aren't they just reinforcing existing inequalities in participation?
That is absolutely the critical normative takeaway. because campaigns rationally focus on high-propensity voters, those who are easier to reach, more likely to respond, already more engaged, often more educated, and affluent mobilization efforts tend to amplify the voices of those already likely to participate.
They're not spending resources trying to bring in the hardest to reach, lowest propensity non-voters.
Generally, no. The cost per vote mobilized is just too high. Why spend 10 times the effort to maybe get one extra vote from a disengaged group when you can get that same vote much more cheaply from someone already leaning your way and likely to vote?
So while mobilization increases overall turnout, which might seem good for democracy,
The way it's strategically deployed often exacerbates existing biases in who participates. The electorate brought to the polls by mobilization still tends to be skewed towards the more privileged segments of society. It's optimized for electoral wins, not necessarily for representative democracy.
and that strategic behavior, optimizing for wins within the current system, that takes us directly to the rules of that system.
Exactly. The reason campaigns are so laser-focused on mobilizing these specific voters in these specific places is entirely dictated by the institutional framework they operate within, namely the Electoral College.
Okay, let's make that pivot. From the micro strategies of getting individuals to vote to the macro rules, the Electoral College that determine how those votes add up. What was the original idea behind it before it got, well, complicated?
Edward B. Foley does a great job reminding us that the original vision was, frankly, quite idealistic and maybe naive in retrospect. The framers envisioned the electors as a kind of deliberative body,
Like a council of wise men.
sort of a filter, almost. They were supposed to be knowledgeable individuals who could exercise independent judgment to select a president with broad national character, someone who could rise above petty, squabbling political factions. It was fundamentally designed, Foley argues, as an anti-party mechanism.
And they had that specific voting rule to encourage that, the two-vote requirement.
Yes, that was key. Each elector cast 2 votes for president, but at least one of those votes had to be for someone from a different state than the elector.
To prevent purely regional candidates.
Exactly. The hope was that electors, using their judgment, would often coalesce around a nationally respected figure as their second choice, ensuring the winner had genuine cross-state appeal. The whole system presumed electors would think for themselves, not just follow a party line.
A presumption that famously didn't last long. The rise of actual political parties, Federalists and Jeffersonian Republicans, basically broke the system almost immediately.
It collapsed spectacularly in the election of 1800. That election was a genuine constitutional crisis, a near-death experience for the young republic.
Because Jefferson and his running mate, Baron Burr, got the same number of electoral votes.
Precisely. The party system had already taken hold. Republican electors dutifully cast their 2 votes for both Jefferson and Burr, as the party instructed. They acted as party agents, not independent deliberators.
Yeah.
Result: a tie.
And a tie throws the election into the House of Representatives.
Right, where each state delegation gets 1 vote. And critically, it was the outgoing, Federalist-controlled lame duck House that had to decide.
So the defeating party had to choose between their arch-nemesis, Jefferson, and his running mate, Burr, whom many distrusted.
An impossible choice for them. They saw Jefferson as a dangerous radical, and Burr as an unprincipled opportunist. The House deadlocked. It took 35 ballots. Tensions were incredibly high. There were credible reports, Foley notes, of state militias in Virginia and Pennsylvania preparing to march on the Capitol if Jefferson was denied the presidency.
Wow. How was it resolved?
Ultimately, Alexander Hamilton, Jefferson's fierce rival, but someone who considered Burr even more dangerous, persuaded enough Federalists to cast blank ballots. This broke the deadlock, allowing Jefferson to finally win on the 36th ballot.
Close call. And the immediate result was a constitutional amendment.
Yes, the 12th Amendment, ratified in 1804, it separated the Electoral College votes for president and vice president, fixing the technical glitch that caused the tie.
But in doing so?
In doing so, it essentially acknowledged and solidified the 2-party system as the norm. And crucially, while it fixed the voting procedure, it retained the fundamental state-based mechanism for allocating electoral votes. It kept the federalist structure where states, not the national popular vote, pick the president.
Okay, let's jump forward 2 centuries. Foley argues the core problem today isn't just the existence of the Electoral College, but that states abandon what he calls authority rule. What does he mean by that? What's the practical difference?
For Foley, authority rule harks back to that original, or at least early principle, that a state's electoral votes should reflect the choice of a majority of voters within that state. If candidate X got 50% plus 1, they got the electors. Simple majority rule, state by state.
But that's not how it works now in most states.
No. Over time, nearly all states shifted to winner-take-all rules.
Mm.
And critically, they tied winner-take-all not to a majority, but to a mere plurality.
Plurality meaning just getting more votes than any other single candidate, even if it's less than 50%.
Exactly. You can win 100% of a state's electoral votes with, say, 48% of the popular vote, as long as your opponent split the other 52%.
And that mechanism is how we get presidents who lose the national popular vote but win the Electoral College.
It's absolutely central to that divergence. The 2016 election is the textbook modern example Foley uses. Donald Trump won the presidency, but he secured 103 of his electoral votes from 6 key states: Florida, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Arizona, North Carolina, where he actually received less than 50% of the popular vote.
He won them with pluralities. Like in Michigan, it was incredibly close, something like 0.2%.
Tiny margins. But under winner-take-all plurality rules, that narrow win gave him all of Michigan's 16 electoral votes, despite nearly 53% of Michiganders voting for someone else.
And those 103 plurality won electoral votes, that was about a third of his total electoral vote count.
Roughly, yes. Without winning those states on pluralities, he wouldn't have reached the 270 needed to win.
So Foley's point isn't necessarily abolish the Electoral College, but rather that the state-level rules for awarding electors specifically, winner-take-all based on plurality, are the real source of the distortion.
That's the core of his argument. The problem lies in how states chose to implement the system, abandoning the principle that the winner should demonstrate majority support within the state to claim its full electoral weight. It amplifies narrow victories into statewide sweeps.
And you can see how this feeds directly back into the campaign strategy we talked about.
Absolutely. If a campaign knows that winning Michigan by 10,000 votes is exactly the same electorally as winning by 500,000 votes,
Then their incentive is just to find and mobilize just enough voters in that specific state to hit that plurality threshold. No need to build a broad majority.
precisely. The macro-structure plurality winner-take-all perfectly reinforces the micro-strategy of hyper-efficient, targeted mobilization in a few key locations. It creates this high-stakes, knife-edge system focused entirely on marginal wins in battleground states. Hashtag tag see Posner's defense of the Electoral College.
Okay, so we see the problems, the divergence, the strategic incentives it creates. But Richard Posner offers a strong defense, arguing the system is actually vital. Why?
Posner's main argument centers on stability and preventing worse outcomes. His primary defense is pragmatic. The Electoral College, almost always, produces a clear and timely winner.
Which he sees as incredibly important.
Paramount. He argues the worst outcome for the country would be an election thrown into the House of Representatives, like in 1800 or 1824. He imagines that process today, in our hyperpolarized environment, as being utterly chaotic, legitimacy-destroying, and potentially endless.
So the occasional popular vote divergence is a lesser evil compared to a contested House election.
That's his core calculation. Better a clear, accepted winner, even if they lost the popular vote, than a constitutional meltdown in Congress. He also argues it prevents majority tyranny.
Okay, how does a system that can let a minority win prevent majority tyranny? That seems counterintuitive.
Posner's argument is about geographic tyranny. He suggests that in a pure national popular vote system, a candidate could potentially win just by mobilizing massive support in a few very populous states or regions, say, sweeping California and the Northeast, even if they're rejected by the rest of the country.
Ah, so a geographically concentrated majority could impose its will.
That's the concern. The Electoral College, by forcing candidates to win states, requires them to build broader coalitions across different states and regions. It reinforces the idea of the U.S. as a federal republic, not just a single national democracy.
It forces geographic breadth, not just depth in a few places.
Right. It protects that state-centric federalist structure. And he also has an interesting take on third parties. Critics often say the Electoral College makes third-party spoilers too powerful in close states.
Like Nader in Florida in 2000, perhaps?
Exactly. But Posner flips this. He argues the Electoral College structure, especially winner-take-all, actually works against both major parties when strong third-party candidates emerge.
How so?
Because a third party getting even a small percentage of the vote, like Gary Johnson or Jill Stein in 2016, can deny either major party the plurality they need to win a key battleground state. This inherent instability, Posner suggests, forces the major parties to be more careful, maybe campaign more broadly, to shore up their support against being spoiled.
That's interesting. So the very instability created by spoilers within the Electoral College system actually forces a kind of discipline on the major parties.
That's Posner's counterargument. It introduces a degree of unpredictable risk for both sides.
So Posner sees it as a flawed but ultimately stabilizing mechanism that protects federalism and prevents the disaster of a House election while also managing the spoiler effect in a roundabout way. Stable overall, maybe, but intensely volatile at the margins in those key states.
That captures his defense well. It prioritizes systemic stability and clear outcomes over pure popular sovereignty. Hashtag tag D. The case against preservation arguments, Speel.
Okay, but then Robert Speel comes along and basically takes a wrecking ball to these kinds of preservation arguments. He targets the three most common defenses. Let's start with the idea that it protects small states.
Speel is really blunt about this one. He calls the small state protection argument patently false.
Why false? Small states do get slightly more electoral weight per capita because every state gets 2 senators plus House reps.
True, they have that slight mathematical bonus. But Speel argues, look at where candidates actually spend their time and money. Do they campaign in Wyoming, Rhode Island, Delaware?
No, they focus on Pennsylvania, Michigan, Arizona, swing states, which can be large or small.
Exactly. Candidates chase competitiveness, not state size. They focus on states where the election is close, regardless of population. The fact that small, non-competitive states are routinely ignored by campaigns proves, Speel argues, that the system doesn't actually protect them in practice. It's a myth, disproven by actual campaign behavior.
Okay, so the small state argument is weak in practice. What about the second defense? Federalism is paramount.
Speel acknowledges the Electoral College obviously supports a federal structure by using state-level results. That's undeniable. But he questions whether preserving federalism, in this specific way, should be the ultimate goal.
He argues federalism is a means, not an end in itself.
Precisely. He says the purpose of the constitutional structure, including federalism, is to create a stable, legitimate Republican government. If a specific federal mechanism, the Electoral College, as currently practiced, consistently produces outcomes where the popular vote loser wins, and this undermines the perceived legitimacy of the government,
then that mechanism is failing its larger purpose, even if it technically supports federalism.
Right. We shouldn't preserve a structure just because it's old or federalist. It needs to serve the contemporary goal of democratic legitimacy. Prioritizing the mechanism over the outcome is getting it backwards, in his view.
Okay. And the third argument Speel tackles, the old idea that electors protect against ignorant voters.
This one he dismisses as completely obsolete. It harks back to that original 18th century vision of electors as wise, deliberative figures who could potentially override a flawed popular choice.
Which just isn't how it works anymore.
Not at all. As Speel points out, electors today are chosen for party loyalty. They are expected and often legally bound to vote for their party's slate. They're essentially figureheads, not independent judges. The idea that they function as a check on an ignorant mass public is pure historical fiction, totally disconnected from modern political reality.
So Speel basically strips away these justifications, small state protection, federalism above all, wise electors, leaving us, in his view, with the core problem.
Which is that plurality winner-take-all rules are fundamentally at odds with majority rule, don't effectively protect small states, and their main function now seems to be injecting volatility and potential illegitimacy into presidential outcomes, especially when third parties are involved. Hashtag EPIs to institutional reform.
All right, so if the current system has these deep problems, but a constitutional amendment to abolish the Electoral College seems politically impossible right now.
Yeah, the hurdles are immense. 2/3 of Congress, 3/4 of the states.
Yeah.
Highly unlikely given the partisan stakes.
Then what are the paths within the existing structure? Foley offers some ideas focused on changing state laws, right? Centered on restoring that idea of authority rule.
Exactly. This is where the reform discussion gets interesting because it sidesteps the need for a constitutional amendment. Foley suggests states themselves could fix the plurality problem by changing their own laws to require a majority for winning electoral votes.
So back to 50% plus one to win all the electors?
Yes. And his key proposal is what happens if no one gets a majority in the state, instead of letting a plurality winner take everything.
The state would distribute its electoral votes proportionally based on the actual vote shares.
Correct, even if it means fractional electoral votes. So in a state with, say, 11 electoral votes, if candidate A gets 49%, candidate B gets 46%, and candidate C gets 5%, candidate A might get roughly 5.4 votes, B gets 5.1, and C gets 0.5, give or take rounding.
The state's electoral slate would actually mirror the state's popular vote division.
Precisely. It restores a link between the popular vote within the state and the electoral votes awarded. It aligns with that Jeffersonian idea that popular sentiment should be proportionally represented. And critically, it kills the incentive to just barely scrape by with a plurality.
Suddenly, every vote matters for that proportional share. Campaigns would want to maximize their percentage everywhere, not just hit 47% in Wisconsin.
It completely changes the strategic calculus. Now, another model that already exists, used by Maine and Nebraska, is the congressional district system.
Right, where they award one electoral vote to the winner of each House district, and then the 2 senatorial votes go to the statewide popular vote winner.
This one's fascinating because it radically increases the number of potentially competitive units, instead of just one statewide contest.
You suddenly have contests within each congressional district.
Exactly. So a state like Nebraska, which is reliably Republican statewide, might suddenly have a competitive race in its Omaha-based congressional district, which is more urban and leans Democratic.
Right. So campaigns would have a reason to actually compete and mobilize voters in that blue district within a red state.
Yes. It forces campaigns to spread resources more widely within states, targeting specific districts rather than just aiming for the statewide plurality. It decentralizes the battleground.
So wouldn't that make gerrymandering of congressional districts even more consequential for presidential outcomes?
That's the major concern, yes. It could tie presidential outcomes even more tightly to potentially manipulated district lines, but it does create more competitive spaces and could spread mobilization efforts.
And then the third option, sometimes discussed, is just pure proportionality across the board.
Right. Dispense with winner-take-all entirely. Just award all of the state's electoral votes based strictly on the statewide popular vote percentage, regardless of majority or districts.
That seems like the most representative option within the Electoral College framework.
It would likely maximize the representativeness of the state's vote and largely eliminate the swing state phenomenon as we know it. Campaigns would have an incentive to chase every vote, everywhere, because every vote contributes to their share of the electoral votes in every state. The map would look very different.
But the political reality of getting any of these reforms passed at the state level seems incredibly difficult. Why would a state currently considered a major battleground, like Pennsylvania or Florida, voluntarily agree to give up its winner-take-all status and dilute its own influence?
That is the multi-billion-dollar question, isn't it? It's the ultimate collective action problem. These reforms mostly have to happen state by state, but any state moving first unilaterally disarms itself, reducing its kingmaker status.
The parties controlling legislature in those key states have a huge incentive to keep the current system, which gives them disproportionate power.
Absolutely. The reform discussion is intellectually rich. How can we make the existing federal system work more democratically? But the political feasibility seems near zero, until perhaps enough states feel the legitimacy crisis outweighs the strategic leverage they currently hold.
It's really striking that the most viable reform paths focus on these state-level rules, not just a big bang abolition. It's about making the existing structure function better, or at least more closely reflect majority will within states.
And the fact we're even having these debates highlights that fundamental, enduring tension in American politics between strategic campaign behavior aimed at winning under the current rules and the broader ideals of democratic representation. Hashtag Tech Outro.
Wow. Okay, that was quite a journey. We started down at the micro level, looking at that single act of voting.
Yeah, the individual citizen's decision.
And found it's profoundly shaped, maybe even engineered, as you said, by these highly strategic mobilization campaigns that are laser-focused on specific voters in specific places.
And then we zoomed out to the macro level rules, the Electoral College structure. And we found that structure, especially with winner-take-all and plurality rules, doesn't just allow that strategic behavior.
It actively encourages it.
It magnifies it, incentivizes it. The micro-strategies and the macro rules, they really fit together perfectly, like hand in glove, creating this system that's, ruthlessly efficient for campaigns maybe, but potentially quite damaging to democratic legitimacy.
So here's maybe the biggest challenge that crystallizes from these readings, especially given that tension. We have mobilization strategies focused on tiny margins, and an electoral college system where the entire outcome can hinge on those tiny margins, a few thousand votes, the behavior of a third party in just a handful of states.
That inherent fragility, that volatility at the tipping point becomes the entire game.
Which leads to this really provocative question for the future, doesn't it? If the current system, flaws and all, offers such a critical, albeit maybe precarious, strategic advantage to whichever party happens to hold the edge in those key states in a given election cycle,
An advantage often dependent on things like third-party votes they can't fully control.
then how likely is it really that we'll see meaningful institutional reforms like Foley's majority rule or proportionality? Why would actors voluntarily adopt reforms that risk undermining the very strategic edge they need and plan to exploit to win next time?
It feels like the political machine, the campaign apparatus, is almost perfectly optimized to operate within the known volatility of the current system. Changing the rules means throwing out the playbook, losing that edge.
So the ultimate tension we're left with, maybe, is this deep conflict between strategic political behavior, which is rational, calculating, focused on winning under the existing rules, and those broader democratic ideals of representation, majority rule, and maybe even legitimacy.
Yeah, and it forces us and you listening to ask, what does the American political system, in practice, seem to value more? Is it electoral efficiency and strategic advantage? Or is it democratic legitimacy in ensuring the outcome reflects the broad will of the people?
A really profound question to think about long after this deep dive ends. Thank you so much for joining us today as we explored the intricate engineering of political participation and these enduring questions about our institutions.
Yeah, thanks for tuning into the discussion.